Undercover boss buys medicine. At his own clinic, shocked hearing two workers plot in the back. Daniel Myers adjusted the worn baseball cap pulled low over his brow as he stepped through the glass doors of Clearway Medical, Cedarbrook Clinic. The sterile scent of antiseptic hit him instantly, familiar yet distant. No one looked up. Perfect. His disguise, khaki windbreaker, faded jeans, and 3 days' worth of salt and pepper stubble, was working. For over 2 decades, Daniel had poured his soul into building Clearway Medical from a single neighborhood clinic into a respected network of local care centers. His dream had always been simple: create a place where quality health care met dignity, not just for patients, but for the people who served them. Yet in recent years, success had come with distance. Expansion had swallowed up his time. Investor meetings, compliance reports, hiring committees. He hadn't walked these halls in months. Still, something had been gnawing at him. On paper, things looked fine. Patient satisfaction was stable. The books are balanced. But employee turnover had quietly surged, and insurance discrepancies kept surfacing without explanation. Then came the anonymous complaint, brief, vague, and deeply unsettling. "They're covering it up, but someone good is getting hurt." That was all it took. Now, Daniel stood quietly in the waiting room of the very clinic where it all began, masked as just another man in need of a checkup. He took a seat in the corner, eyes scanning the front desk, the intake hallway, and the janitor's closet tucked near the stairwell. From here, he would watch. He would listen. And if the whisper was true, if someone truly was being silenced, discarded, or destroyed under his name, then by the time he left this clinic, so would the truth. Daniel sat quietly in the far corner of the waiting area, his eyes hidden beneath the brim of a plain ball cap. He clutched a clipboard with mock intake forms, his fake insurance card already tucked into the back pocket of his worn jeans. No one gave him a second glance. That was the point. It had been over a decade since Clearway Medical's first clinic opened in Cedarbrook. Back then, it was a small, underfunded dream, an idea born from Daniel's sleepless nights, watching his mother struggle through a broken healthcare system. But now, the network had grown into something much bigger, sleeker, more efficient, and somehow colder. He'd received glowing reviews, of course, impressive patient satisfaction, polished quarterly reports. But lately, turnover had spiked. Complaints had started trickling in, strangely phrased things like "felt uncomfortable," "rushed," or "just not the same anymore." There were whispers of missing inventory, insurance discrepancies, and one particular anonymous email that wouldn't leave his mind. The numbers may look fine, but the soul of this place is being drained from the inside. That's why he was here, not as a CEO, but as an invisible patient. From his seat near the magazine rack, he watched people come and go. A young father with a toddler is coughing into a stuffed animal. A woman in scrubs rubbing her temples between calls. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead. It all looked normal. But something about the energy was off. Then Daniel noticed him. Alan Brooks. The janitor moved quietly along the far hallway, pushing a mop cart with slow, practiced care. He wore a pale blue polo embroidered with the Clearway logo, faded from too many washes, and his gray slacks had a worn seam near the pocket. Alan didn't rush. He didn't need to. Every movement was purposeful. He wiped down the waiting room chairs without fanfare, adjusted a crooked poster in the hallway, and nodded kindly to a nervous teenager sitting alone with a cast on her arm. "Morning, Alan," one elderly woman called as she shuffled out of the lab room. Alan smiled, soft and genuine. "How was the blood draw today, Ms. Peterson?" "No worse than yesterday," she chuckled. "Your mint still behind the front desk?" "Always." Daniel watched as Alan shuffled over to the reception desk, leaving a small bowl of individually wrapped peppermints beside the check-in tablet. No one asked him to. No one even noticed, but it mattered. To someone, it mattered, but not to everyone. From the billing window, Daniel heard a sharp voice. "Seriously?" Again with the candy bowl. Vanessa. She leaned against the counter with her arms crossed, rolling her eyes as Alan walked away. "He thinks he's everyone's grandpa. I swear he's just doing this to make himself feel useful." Dylan, seated behind a desk nearby, laughed under his breath. "More like trying to stay awake. He smells like bleach and sadness." Vanessa giggled. "Walking health code violation. I mean, come on. He barely knows how to work the floor buffer. Yesterday, he tripped the alarm trying to open the janitor's closet." Daniel's jaw tightened. Their voices weren't loud, but they weren't exactly whispering either. And worse, they weren't joking. Not really. It was the tone, the dismissiveness, the casual cruelty. Alan had already turned the corner down the hall. He hadn't heard a word. Or maybe he had. Daniel studied the man's back as he disappeared around the corner. There was something in the slump of his shoulders, something in the way he paused briefly before turning into the next hallway, just long enough to let the sting pass, then keep moving. Vanessa returned to her phone, tapping away with long, manicured nails. Dylan opened a bag of chips and leaned back in his chair. Daniel looked around. Not one other staff member said a word. No one even seemed to notice. But he did. He saw Alan holding the place together in quiet, invisible ways. And he saw two younger employees tearing it apart with whispered jokes and smirks, proud of their sharpness, unaware of their rot. There was no policy against what they'd done. No manager would write them up. But Daniel knew this was where it always started. Not with theft or fraud, with attitude, with small, unchecked disrespect, with forgetting that dignity isn't measured by age, speed, or rank. It's measured by how someone treats the person they think doesn't matter. And Alan mattered. Daniel didn't know what exactly was broken inside this clinic, but he had a feeling Alan was holding up more than mops and trash bags. And if the others couldn't see it yet, he'd make sure they would. Tomorrow, he'd stay longer. Tomorrow, he'd follow the whispers. And tomorrow, he'd learn the full story, because the surface wasn't telling him enough. Not yet. Daniel returned the next morning, dressed exactly the same. Faded polo, khakis, a subtle back brace that made him blend in with the morning crowd of patients, nurses, and delivery staff. No one paid him any attention, which was precisely what he wanted. He checked in again under the name Greg Mitchell and took a seat near the hallway, quietly sipping on a cup of clinic coffee that tasted like warm paper. He wasn't here for the caffeine. He was watching. Vanessa and Dylan arrived within minutes of each other. Vanessa swiped her badge at the staff entrance with her usual dramatic sigh and flicked her hair over one shoulder. Dylan followed, AirPods in, bobbing his head to some beat only he could hear. Neither noticed Alan, who was already mopping near the back exit, his movements slow but rhythmic, like a man who had found a kind of peace in repetition. But peace was not what this place was becoming. Daniel tilted his head as he overheard snippets of conversation behind the reception glass. "You said it worked last week, right?" Vanessa asked in a hushed voice. Dylan nodded, glancing toward the locked medicine cabinet across the room. "Easy. Bump the dosage entry on the report, scan the barcode from the sample bin, then discard the extras in the expired tray." Vanessa clicked her pen twice. "And the insurance doesn't flag it?" "Only if someone actually double-checks the disposal log," Dylan smirked, "which no one does, not even Cassandra." Daniel leaned slightly closer, pretending to scroll through his phone. The mention of Cassandra, the branch manager, piqued his interest. She had always struck him as well-meaning but passive, a stickler for paperwork, but reluctant to confront. "Okay," Vanessa continued. "So what's the plan for Alan?" Dylan opened a drawer and pulled out a form. "This," he said, tapping it twice. "Inventory transfer slip. I pre-filled it yesterday with an expired shipment number. Just needs a signature. Vanessa raised an eyebrow. And we leave it in the back med bin. Tomorrow we'll find the form and claim it was supposed to be filed, but it went missing. And guess who was last seen cleaning the med disposal area? Her eyes widened. He won't even know what hit him. Exactly, Dylan said, voice dripping with false innocence. He gets blamed for a $2,000 discrepancy, Cassandra panics, and, boom, automatic suspension for negligence. Vanessa bit her lip, barely containing her satisfaction. And then you tell your cousin there's an opening. Dylan grinned. Split the referral bonus, easy win. Daniel felt the familiar cold spread in his chest. It was happening again, only worse. This wasn't just about backroom gossip or cruel nicknames. This was deliberate, calculated. They were going to ruin a man's life to pad their wallets. He took a breath, grounding himself in the moment. He had to be sure, completely sure, before taking action. If he confronted them now, they'd spin it. I claimed it was a joke. Deny, delay, hide behind protocol. But if he waited, if he watched, he could build something undeniable. From the corner of his eye, he spotted Alan down the hall, quietly changing out the biohazard bag with careful gloves and a respectful silence. A nurse passed by without a glance, not even a nod. Alan simply kept working, adjusting the tray of Sharps containers so they wouldn't tip. There was no trace of bitterness in the way he moved, no resentment, only quiet dignity. And Daniel couldn't help but think, how many times had this man protected people he didn't even know? How many spills had he cleaned that would have caused a fall? How many patients had been spared infection because Alan caught something others missed? But no one saw that on a chart. And in this place, people like Dylan and Vanessa had learned to weaponize the blind spots in the system, the cracks where decent people slipped through, unnoticed and unprotected. Daniel's heart pounded, but his expression remained calm. He scribbled a fake note on his clipboard, stood up slowly, and walked toward the hallway, making a mental note to return with a recording device. If they were planning this, they'd speak of it again. People like that always did. They loved the sound of their own cleverness. He passed Alan on the way out. The janitor looked up and smiled faintly. "Have a good one, sir." Daniel nodded. "You too." But as he stepped into the sunlight, Daniel knew this story was only beginning. And this time, he wouldn't just be observing. He'd be waiting, watching. Because something sacred was about to be stolen, and he wasn't going to let that happen. Not in the place he built, not on his watch. The sun had dipped below the Cedar Brook treetops by the time Daniel Myers stepped out of his car and leaned against the cool metal of the door. The parking lot behind Clearway Medical had emptied. Only the flickering glow of one security light remained, casting long shadows across the dumpster area, the rear fence, and the rows of staff vehicles that came and went without much notice. Except for one. Alan Brooks' old beige Toyota Camry sat in the far corner, tucked behind a half-collapsed wooden shed and camouflaged by overgrown hedges. Daniel had watched the car before, watched how it never moved far, never seemed to leave the lot at all. That was the first clue. Tonight, he stayed later than usual, just to see. At exactly 8:06 p.m., Alan emerged from the back door of the clinic, still in his pale blue janitor shirt, sleeves rolled up, mop handle in one hand, lunch pail in the other. He locked the back gate, glanced around once, automatically, not fearfully, and made his way toward the old Camry. But instead of opening the driver's side door, Alan walked past it, straight toward the storage shed. Daniel straightened. Alan pushed gently against the warped wooden door. It resisted at first, then gave with a groan. A dull yellow light flickered to life inside. Daniel waited, his breath caught somewhere between guilt and heartbreak, before slowly approaching the fence line, careful not to crunch a single leaf beneath his feet. Through the slats of the fence, he saw it. Not a home, not even a shelter, just a converted storage space. The kind contractors once used to keep extra floor tile and wet vacs. Now, inside, a narrow cot with a threadbare quilt, a cracked plastic chair beside a folding table with a hot plate and a single chipped mug. A small heater hummed near the far wall, struggling against the cold. A suitcase, half-zipped, sat beside a stack of neatly folded uniforms, identical to the one Alan wore every day. Alan knelt beside a battered file box and pulled out a faded envelope. His hands moved with slow care, as if every motion was a ritual. Daniel couldn't see what was inside until Alan lifted it to the light. An old photograph, frayed at the corners. A woman, smiling faintly. Her eyes are gentle. A scarf was wrapped around her head. Daniel's throat tightened. Alan sat heavily on the edge of the cot and pulled out a checkbook. From a tin box, he counted out a small stack of bills, precise, folded, immaculate, and placed them into an envelope marked North Hill Oncology Center. Even now, even after she was gone, he was still paying, still honoring a promise, still carrying a debt no one but him would ever see. Daniel's grip on the fence rail tightened. This man who was mocked for smelling of bleach and walking too slow was living in a storage unit just to keep a promise. Alan stood and moved to a corner shelf. There, Daniel saw a small spiral notebook, dog-eared and barely holding together. Alan flipped through a few pages, paused, and carefully scribbled something down. Daniel leaned in, squinting through the shadows. Page after page, handwritten lines. The patient couldn't pay $15 for antibiotics. Covered. Elderly man confused by insurance form. Helped call daughter. Single mom left crying at front desk. Bought formula at lunch break. These weren't notes from a janitor. They were acts of quiet rebellion, of kindness, of dignity. Daniel stepped back from the fence, overwhelmed. His company's records had never shown this. No manager had ever reported it. And yet here it was, an entire record of compassion, scribbled in silence. He returned to his car, heart heavier than he could remember in years. As he turned the ignition, he glimpsed himself in the rearview mirror and barely recognized the man looking back. Somewhere along the way, buried under expansion deals and quarterly targets, he'd stopped seeing people like Alan. But Alan had never stopped seeing others. Daniel sat in the dark, engine idling, and made a silent vow. No matter what Vanessa and Dylan had planned, he wouldn't just expose it. He would make sure no one like Alan ever had to carry this weight alone again. Not while he was still breathing, not while this place still bore his name. The next morning at Clearway Medical felt sharper. The light is too sterile, the walls are too silent. Daniel sat again in the corner chair of the waiting room, the same rumpled flannel and khakis from the day before. No clipboard, no laptop, no phone out. Just watching the trap get set. Alan was already on his hands and knees in the pediatric exam room, scrubbing a faint stain near the baseboard no one else would have noticed. His motions were slow, meticulous, like someone performing an act of devotion, not just maintenance. His breath came with a quiet wheeze Daniel hadn't noticed before. Across the room, Vanessa leaned against the nurse's station, scrolling through her phone. Dylan stood beside her, holding a clipboard he wasn't really reading. "Did you swap the labels?" Dylan muttered low enough that no one but Daniel, who had repositioned himself near the hallway vent, could hear. Vanessa nodded, eyes still on her screen. Moved the trial meds into the expired bin, adjusted the count. Looks like Alan missed a disposal handoff. "You're sure Cassandra'll bite?" "She's already on edge. The audit's next week. She'll want a scapegoat." Dylan smirked. "And Alan's perfect. No login history, no barcode scans, no one will question it. He doesn't even know how the damn inventory system works." Vanessa put her phone away. $2,000 worth of injectable hormones, missing from the ledger. When it flags, I'll find the disposal form in the trash room, half smudged with mop water." They both laughed. Dylan slapped the clipboard against his palm. "After this, we will talk to HR about bringing in my cousin. You'll back me, right? Referral bonus, split 50-50. Done." Daniel closed his eyes, jaw clenched so tight he could feel the pulse in his temple. The plan was in motion. It wasn't just cruelty now. It was calculated fraud, and the noose was tightening fast. By noon, Cassandra was pacing near the medication supply cabinet, a tablet in her hand, and a frown burrowed deep between her brows. "Who signed off on the disposal for Lot 284-H?" she asked sharply. No one answered. "Anyone?" she snapped. Dylan stepped forward, eyebrows raised in mock surprise. "Actually, I saw Alan in the back room this morning, near the disposal bins. Maybe he—" Vanessa chimed in smoothly. "Yeah, and he asked me where the sealed bag labels were. Said he'd figure it out himself. I didn't think anything of it." Cassandra's face tightened. "He's not authorized for that." Alan, who had just stepped out of the break room, looked over, confused. "I'm sorry. What's this about?" Cassandra turned. "Mr. Brooks, did you handle any medication disposals this morning?" Alan blinked. "No, ma'am. I just took out the regular trash. I wouldn't touch the med bins." "Then, can you explain why your initials are logged next to the locker entry at 7:43 a.m.? I don't know anything about—" "We're missing over $2,000 in restricted meds," Cassandra interrupted. "And your badge was used to unlock the unit." Alan's mouth opened, then closed. His hands, still damp from washing a cart, trembled slightly. "I never touched the locker," he said, voice quiet. "I don't even know the code." "Well, someone used your badge," Vanessa said, arms folded. "And someone tossed a crumpled disposable form into the trash room with mop water damage. Funny coincidence." Daniel stood, ready to intervene, but held back. "Not yet." Cassandra crossed her arms. "Until we get to the bottom of this, I'm going to have to suspend you, Mr. Brooks." Alan didn't protest. He just nodded, slowly, as if he'd been waiting for this moment, somewhere deep down. As if, after a lifetime of being overlooked, he somehow expected to be blamed. He turned away, walking with a stiffness Daniel hadn't seen before. The old man packed his things into a paper grocery bag, no briefcase, no backpack, just folded his extra shirt, stuffed his notebook inside, and buttoned his coat with slow, deliberate care. Several elderly patients sitting near the window watched, brows furrowed. One of them, a woman with a cane, stood up as Alan walked past and asked, "Did something happen?" Alan just gave her a small smile. "Nothing I can't clean up." And then he walked out the front door. Not a word, not a fight, not even a look back. Daniel rose slowly from his seat, eyes burning. The trap had been laid. The man had been humiliated in public, disgraced without cause. But the story wasn't over. Not even close. Because Daniel Myers had seen enough. And tomorrow he wasn't coming back as a patient. He was coming back as the man who owned the building. The following morning, Clearway Medical opened to its usual rhythm. Front desk phones ringing, the hum of fluorescent lights, the low murmur of patients checking in. But beneath that calm, something had shifted. Daniel Myers wasn't sitting in the waiting room today. He walked in through the front doors just after 8 a.m., still in the same plain jeans and utility jacket he'd worn all week. But this time, he didn't go to the check-in desk. He didn't sit and observe. He walked straight to the center of the lobby and stopped. Vanessa looked up from her terminal, confused. "Can I help you?" she asked, voice coated in habitual cheeriness. Daniel took off his cap. The moment his full face came into view, something in the air changed. Cassandra, walking out of exam room 2 with a clipboard, froze. Her eyes widened. "Mr. Myers?" Gasps swept across the room. Patients paused mid-sentence. A nurse at the far end dropped her pen. Vanessa stood up so fast her chair rolled back. "Wait, you're—" "Yes," Daniel said calmly, his voice low but firm. "I'm Daniel Myers, founder and CEO of Clearway Medical. Dead silence. Even the hum of the printer seemed to quiet. "I've been here for the past 3 days. Undercover," Daniel continued, sweeping his gaze across the room. "Watching, listening, learning what happens when leadership looks away too long." He reached into his jacket and pulled out a slim black tablet. "Because I had a feeling something was broken. And I was right." He turned to Cassandra, who stood frozen halfway between fear and disbelief. "Ms. Vega, you said our security system was overdue for upgrades." Cassandra nodded slowly. "Yes, sir. The request was sent 6 months ago." Daniel glanced at Vanessa. "And you claimed the cameras hadn't worked in weeks." Vanessa didn't respond. Her throat bobbed as she swallowed. "Well," Daniel said quietly, "I personally approved emergency maintenance 3 days ago. What you didn't know is that new micro cameras were installed that same night, in the med locker, in the inventory room, in the hallway, all with audio." He turned to face the assembled staff and patients. "I'd like everyone to see what was really happening at Clearway." He tapped the screen. A nearby wall-mounted monitor blinked to life. The room dimmed slightly as everyone turned toward it. The first video showed Vanessa, alone, rifling through the med cabinet. She stuffed a small box into her tote bag, then quickly scribbled something on a disposal form before crumpling it. Gasps echoed through the room. Then came Dylan, in the office after hours, altering entries in the insurance database, changing dates, tweaking dosage logs, and masking inconsistencies. The audio was damning. "We pinned this on Alan," Dylan whispered, glancing over his shoulder. "No badge log, no digital trail," Vanessa replied. "He won't even know what hit him." "I'll find the disposal note in the mop bin tomorrow." They laughed. The monitor froze on Vanessa, smirking mid-sentence. The silence that followed was suffocating. A man in scrubs stepped away from the wall, shaking his head. Cassandra looked like she might collapse. I didn't know. I swear." Daniel held up a hand. "You didn't. That's not the issue." He turned back to the rest of the staff. "The issue is what we let this place become when we stop listening to people like Alan Brooks." Daniel's voice trembled now, not with weakness, but with restrained fury. "You suspended a man who never once asked for credit, who showed up early, stayed late, and took pride in wiping the corners no one else bothered to see. A man who helped patients without ever asking who they were, what insurance they had, or whether someone was watching." He paused. "And we repaid that by letting him be humiliated in front of patients." Vanessa's face crumpled. "Mr. Myers, please." "No." His tone sharpened. "You don't get to beg now. You don't get to cry because you got caught. You planted evidence. You mocked a man whose shoes you couldn't even fill on your best day." Dylan tried to slip toward the hallway. "Don't," Daniel warned. "Security's already been called, and law enforcement has a full copy of the footage." As if on cue, 2 uniformed officers entered the lobby. "Daniel Myers?" one asked. Daniel handed over the tablet. "Everything you need is in there." Vanessa buried her face in her hands. Dylan didn't fight as the officers led them both away. Daniel watched them go, then turned to the staff, his voice softer now. "Alan Brooks gave us more than clean floors. He gave us integrity, compassion. He gave us our soul back when the system forgot it." Cassandra's voice trembled. "Where is he now?" Daniel exhaled slowly. "He left yesterday, with his dignity intact, but his heart broken." And then he looked toward the door. "Which is why we're going to fix this. Not just today, but for every day forward." The crowd in the lobby didn't applaud. Not yet. They were still processing what had just happened, but somewhere in that stillness, a collective breath was held. Because justice, real, messy, human justice, was finally walking through the door. Alan didn't return to work the next morning. His absence was like a weight across the entire clinic. The cleaning cart stayed tucked in the corner. The hallways, though freshly mopped by someone else, somehow didn't gleam the same. There was no quiet whistle echoing faintly from the supply closet. No soft knock on break room doors before entering. Just silence, and the kind that reminded people something essential was missing. Daniel felt it the moment he walked through the doors of Clearway Medical. This building had always been functional, but Alan Brooks had made it feel cared for, human. By 10 a.m., Daniel called a staff meeting, not in the back office, not behind glass. Right there in the patient lobby with every nurse, technician, administrator, and every patient willing to stay and listen. He stood in front of the reception desk. No suit, no speech, just a man who had seen the truth and refused to look away again. "I owe someone a public apology," he said, "and it's long overdue." Cassandra looked over, her eyes already glistening. The younger nurses, especially the ones who used to brush past Alan without a word, shifted uncomfortably in their scrubs. Daniel cleared his throat. "Alan Brooks," he said, voice steady, "is the reason this clinic still has a soul." And then he turned to the front door. It opened. Alan stepped inside slowly, hat in hand, unsure if he should be there. He wore a clean button-up shirt that had clearly been ironed with care. His shoes, though worn, were polished, but his shoulders were tight, his eyes wary. Daniel stepped forward, offering a hand. "Alan," he said softly, "thank you for coming." "I wasn't sure I should," Alan replied. "Didn't want to cause trouble." Daniel gave a small, almost painful smile. "You never did, Alan. That's the problem. You gave and never once asked to be seen." Then louder, so everyone in the room could hear, he turned to the crowd. "This man," Daniel said, "was falsely accused, humiliated in front of patients, and suspended without evidence. But instead of fighting back, he walked away. With grace. That's who he is." A patient in the waiting room, the elderly woman Alan used to bring coffee to on cold mornings, stood and clapped. Then a nurse joined. Then the entire room. Alan stood there, stunned, eyes shining but jaw clenched. Daniel gestured for quiet. "I reviewed every hour of security footage, every log, every interaction. What I saw," he said, turning to Alan, "was someone who not only worked hard but protected others, even when no one was watching." Daniel stepped closer. "You deserve more than an apology, Alan. You deserve to be honored." He reached into his coat pocket and handed Alan a slim envelope. "This is a formal letter of reinstatement along with a promotion. Effective immediately, you'll be overseeing our new community integrity program. Your job isn't to mop floors anymore. It's to help us clean up the culture we let rot." Alan looked down at the letter, his hands trembling. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to," Daniel replied. "You already said it all, with your actions." A second envelope followed. "In here," Daniel said gently, "is something else. The lease to a small apartment 2 blocks from here. Paid in full. No more garage behind the lot. No more walking home in the cold." Alan's composure cracked then. He looked down, swallowing hard. "I just wanted to do my job," he whispered. "You did," Daniel said, "and you reminded the rest of us what that job really means." The room fell silent again, but it was the kind of silence that came before something important, before something changed. A nurse stepped forward. "Mr. Brooks, I'm sorry. I never thanked you. But I learned a lot watching you." "Me too," said another. Even Cassandra stepped up. "I failed you," she said quietly. "I believed what I saw on a spreadsheet over what I saw in a person. I'm so sorry." Alan took a breath, eyes wet but voice steady. "I forgive you," he said. "But promise me, next time someone's invisible, you look closer." Daniel turned to the crowd one last time. "This clinic," he said, "was built to heal. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that healing isn't just for the body. It's for dignity, for trust, for character." He looked back at Alan, who now stood taller than he had in days. "Today, we begin again." The applause that followed wasn't just for Alan, it was for redemption, for truth, for the quiet people who hold the world up without asking for recognition. And this time, they were finally seen. The air in the clinic had shifted. Patients lingered a little longer in the lobby that morning. Staff moved more thoughtfully through the halls. Even the silence between appointments felt different. Less routine, more reverent. But Alan Brooks remained the same. He declined the offer to take the rest of the day off. "I appreciate it," he told Daniel, "but I've got work to do. Just not with a mop anymore." And so, with a simple ID badge pinned to his new gray sweater, Alan quietly took his seat in the office now marked Community Integrity Advisor. He hadn't asked for a desk, hadn't expected an inbox full of messages from staff and patients thanking him, but most of all, he hadn't anticipated what came next. It started with a knock. A young receptionist named Lila peeked in, eyes wide with hesitation. Mr. Brooks, there's someone asking to see you. She says it's about something from a while back." Personal Alan frowned slightly, puzzled. "Did she give a name?" "No, sir," Lila replied. "But she brought a child with her." Alan stood slowly, bones aching but posture dignified. "All right," he said, adjusting his cardigan. "Send her in." The woman who entered was in her early 30s, petite, with eyes that carried something far heavier than her years. Her little girl, maybe 8 or 9, clung to her coat, eyes darting around the room. Alan's brow furrowed, not in recognition, but in concern. "How can I help you, ma'am?" The woman sat gently, placing a folder on the desk between them. "You don't know me, Mr. Brooks," she began, "but I think you knew my daughter a few years ago." Alan glanced at the child beside her, thin, nervous, with a subtle twitch of her hand near her collarbone. Trauma lived in gestures like that. Alan knew. He had seen it. "My little girl," the woman continued, "was in a car accident when she was 5. Her father didn't make it. She survived, but she was never the same." Alan's face softened. "She developed severe PTSD, screamed at the sight of white coats, wouldn't let doctors near her. We came here, to this clinic, after 3 other places turned us away." And then the woman's voice faltered. She looked down, hands clasped tightly. "I couldn't afford the therapy she needed. Not full-time. Not the way the psychiatrist recommended. But one day, I got a call from the billing office saying an anonymous sponsor had covered 6 months in advance. No name. Just community support." Alan's hand slowly rose to his mouth, eyes flickering as memory stirred. "I always wondered who it was," the woman whispered, "until yesterday when I saw the news about what happened here. About you." She slid the folder across the desk. Inside were receipts, notes, billing statements marked PAID, and a small yellow sticky note in handwriting Alan instantly recognized, his own. Help her feel safe again. The little girl, quiet until now, suddenly reached into her jacket and pulled out a drawing. It showed a janitor with a broom standing in front of a hospital room. Beside him was a little girl smiling. Alan blinked. "Did you draw this?" The girl nodded shyly. "That's me," she said. "And that's you. You used to give me stickers and talk about birds." Alan's voice caught in his throat. "I remember now," he said hoarsely. "You loved cardinals." The girl smiled. "Still do." Daniel, who had quietly stepped into the hallway just moments earlier, stood watching the exchange from the doorframe. He said nothing. He didn't want to interrupt what was clearly sacred, but he saw it, clear as day. The legacy Alan never claimed. The lives he changed without ever needing to be thanked. The mother stood, reaching for her daughter's hand. I just wanted to say thank you for giving her back to me. Alan gently touched the child's shoulder. You don't owe me anything, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I only ever wanted her to know that kindness still existed. As they left, Daniel finally stepped forward. I didn't know, he said quietly. Alan gave a faint smile. I never wanted anyone to. Daniel nodded, humbled. But the world needs to know. Not just for you, but because stories like this remind people there's still good out there. Alan didn't reply. He just returned to his desk, gently setting the drawing beside his computer. A small child's version of truth, rendered in crayon, more valuable than any diploma, title, or plaque. That afternoon, Daniel sent an internal memo to all Clearway locations. Starting next month, a new initiative will launch, Brooks Benevolence Grants. Staff may nominate patients or families in crisis for silent aid. No red tape, no press releases, just help. Quiet, human, and real, just like the man who inspired it. Across the network, hundreds of messages poured in. But Alan Brooks didn't change. He showed up early the next morning, humming faintly as he watered the plants near the front desk. And when a nervous intern forgot her lunch, he quietly left a sandwich on her desk, with a post-it note that read, "You're doing just fine." Because some people don't need a spotlight to make a difference. They just need a hallway, a mop, and a heart big enough to carry others. The next morning, as the quiet rhythm of the clinic resumed its usual pulse, something unexpected arrived in the mailroom. It wasn't addressed to human resources, not even to the CEO. It was written in careful cursive on the front of a simple white envelope. For Mr. Alan Brooks, please deliver directly. Lila, the receptionist, placed it gently on Alan's desk before lunch. She didn't say anything, only smiled and tapped the top of the envelope twice before walking away. Alan looked at it for a long while before opening it. Inside, there was just one sheet of paper, handwritten, the kind of letter people don't write anymore unless it really matters. Dear Mr. Brooks, you won't remember me, but I remember you. 6 years ago, I was a third-year medical student rotating through Clearway's Cedar Brook Clinic. I was sleep-deprived, barely eating, emotionally fraying at every edge. I had just failed an important practical exam and told myself I wasn't cut out for this. For medicine, for people, for anything. That night, after hours, I stayed behind to cry in one of the empty consultation rooms. I remember thinking, irrationally, that even the janitor would look down on me. Then I heard the soft clatter of a trash bin being emptied. You didn't say anything at first, just tidied around me as if I weren't curled up on the floor like a heap of failure. Then, just before leaving, you paused at the doorway and said, so quietly I almost thought I imagined it, "You did your best today. That's more than most can say. You didn't even look at me when you said it. Maybe because you sensed I couldn't handle pity. But that sentence, that one simple truth, stayed with me. It became my anchor. I told myself if the janitor, someone who saw everything behind the scenes, thought I had worth, maybe I did. I didn't quit. I stayed. I graduated. And now, I'm the senior physician at Clearway's Belmont branch. When the internal memo came through yesterday about your new role and the investigation you helped expose, I just sat there staring at my screen. Because suddenly, everything came full circle. Mr. Brooks, you didn't just mop floors. You mopped up broken dreams and self-doubt. You restored quiet pieces of people they thought no one saw. You certainly did for me. So thank you. You saved a doctor who almost walked away from it all, and I hope one day I can do for someone what you did for me. With respect and gratitude, Dr. Rachel Lynn Allen didn't move for a long time after reading it. The clinic buzzed around him. Phones rang, sneakers squeaked down hallways, carts rattled past his door. But for him, time stood still. He didn't cry. Not quite. But his eyes stayed fixed on the words long after the ink had dried. Daniel stepped in just moments later, catching sight of the letter still open on the desk. "Everything okay?" he asked gently. Allen slid the paper across without a word. Daniel read it quietly. When he finished, he looked up, speechless. "I don't remember saying it," Allen murmured. "But I suppose sometimes the little things are what matter." Daniel nodded. "Sometimes the janitor says more in one sentence than a doctor says in 10 years. He walked out without another word, giving Allen the space to breathe in what he'd just learned. Outside, word of the letter had already started to ripple through the clinic. Staff gathered near the break room, reading a copy pinned discreetly beside the employee bulletin board. Some wiped their eyes. Others just stood in silence, as if recalibrating their understanding of the quiet man in the gray sweater. And patients, overhearing the chatter, began sharing their own stories. "I remember when I was in a wheelchair after surgery. Allen used to wait with me until my ride came, just so I wouldn't be alone. He fixed the heater in the children's wing on Christmas Eve, stayed all night to make sure it didn't break again. He helped my mom find her hearing aid in a trash bin, spent an hour digging through used gloves and gauze without complaining. These weren't heroic acts in the traditional sense. They were better. They were human. And slowly, Alan Brooks, the man who never asked for recognition, never sought a spotlight, became the mirror through which everyone else saw what Clearway was supposed to stand for. Not efficiency, not expansion, but dignity. Care. The kind you can't fake. The kind that echoes back to you years later in the form of a letter. That afternoon, Daniel made a quiet decision. Every onboarding packet for new Clearway staff would now include a printed version of Dr. Lynn's letter. It would be titled, "The Man Who Said One Sentence That Saved a Doctor's Life." Because sometimes the heart of a clinic doesn't wear a white coat. It pushes a mop, smiles when no one's looking, and restores broken pieces without needing to be seen. And now, finally, he was. Daniel waited until the clinic had quieted. That gentle afternoon lull when appointments slowed, and the hum of machines was softened by the rustle of paperwork and the occasional cough down the hall. He stood just outside the break room, the same room where Alan had eaten alone so many times, sipping from a thermos and reading the same worn paperback until his next shift started. But today, it was different. Every member of the Cedar Brook team had been called in for a staff meeting. No explanation, only a request to gather. Even a few patients stayed behind, quietly seated near the windows, as if they could sense something important was about to happen. Alan entered last, still in his gray janitor uniform, still with his quiet, hesitant posture that made him appear smaller than he truly was. Daniel met him in the center of the room. "You always show up last," Daniel said gently, "but you're the first one we should have seen." Alan tried to wave it off with a soft chuckle. "I just clean floors, sir." "No," Daniel replied, his voice steady but full. "You clean up everything the rest of us miss. You keep this place human." He motioned to Cassandra, the shift manager, who walked forward, holding a small black folder and a silver key. Daniel took both. "Alan," he said, turning to face the room, "this company owes you more than an apology. It owes you a future." He opened the folder and handed it to Alan. "Effective today, you are no longer on the custodial staff. You are being promoted to Director of Community Care and Facility Dignity for all Clearway Medical locations." A ripple of surprise spread through the crowd, a title no one had heard before, because it hadn't existed until now. You'll advise our leadership team on how to treat patients, staff, and yes, even janitors, with the respect they deserve. Your salary will reflect a leadership position. Your hours will be manageable, and your word will carry the weight it always should have. Alan's hands trembled slightly as he stared at the folder. "There's more," Daniel continued, reaching into his pocket and placing a small house key in Alan's palm. "2 blocks from here, a small home. No leaks, no rust, no rent. It's yours." Alan blinked, lips parting, but no words came. "We spoke with the bank. Your wife's remaining hospital bills? Cleared." A sharp inhale came from the back of the room. One nurse began to cry. "You've paid in loyalty," Daniel said. "Paid in silence, in dignity. That's enough." Alan looked down at the key, the folder, and the dozens of eyes watching him. For a moment, he looked ready to step back, to deflect, to hand it all away. But then, something shifted in his expression, a quiet pride rising up where there had once been only humble retreat. He looked Daniel in the eye and said simply, "Thank you for seeing me." A hush followed. Then the room erupted, not in corporate applause, but in something real. Doctors stepped forward. Nurses clapped slowly. Even patients stood up. No one rushed to leave. No one checked their phones. Because in that moment, they weren't just witnessing a promotion, they were witnessing a promise being fulfilled. One nurse placed a hand on Alan's shoulder. "You helped all of us," she said softly, "and we didn't even know how much until now." Alan didn't smile widely. He didn't cry. He just stood taller. It was the first time in years he looked like a man who knew he belonged. Daniel turned back to the crowd. "Let this be a new chapter for Clearway, one where people like Alan don't slip through the cracks, one where doing the right thing isn't punished, it's protected." There was nothing more to say. But the look on Alan's face, calm, steady, full of light, said everything. Not just about him, but about who Clearway would become because of him. The days following Alan's promotion felt like spring after a long, bitter winter. Patients who'd once rushed in and out now lingered to shake his hand. Nurses brought him coffee without being asked. Even the shyest intern began calling him Mr. Brooks, not out of formality, but out of respect. But the biggest change wasn't in how others saw Alan. It was in how the entire system began to see itself. Daniel returned to headquarters in a quiet storm. Gone were the sleek boardroom presentations, the investor-first language, the sterile metrics that once made Clearway feel more like a franchise than a place of healing. Instead, Daniel took the mic at the quarterly leadership summit and opened with a photo of Alan sweeping the clinic floor. "This," he said, voice echoing across the room, "is the man who saved our souls." Then, over the next hour, Daniel rolled out the most sweeping reforms in Clearway Medical's history. First, living wages for all non-medical staff. From janitors to front desk assistants, no one would work 2 jobs to survive. Second, comprehensive mental health coverage and emergency relief funds, particularly for employees supporting sick family members, like Alan had done for years, without ever asking. Third, a new internal task force to audit billing practices and eliminate insurance manipulation with surprise spot checks and patient reviews. Fourth, the formation of the Alan Brooks Human Dignity Fund, a grant program dedicated to supporting elderly, disabled, or financially struggling Clearway staff and local patients. The fund would start with $1 million of Daniel's own salary contribution. Fifth, and this one silenced the room, a restructuring of the company's internal ethics board, with Alan Brooks himself invited to serve as a senior advisor. "He may not have a degree in business," Daniel said, "but he's got something better, an unshakable moral compass, and from now on, we'll be steering by it." Back at the Cedar Brook Clinic, the ripple effect was immediate. 1 week later, a middle-aged nurse who had nearly quit returned after hearing what had changed. 2 former receptionists applied to rejoin. A young therapist, once overwhelmed by pressure, now volunteers to help manage Clearway's staff wellness program, inspired by Alan's quiet example of giving without asking for credit. As for Cassandra, the former shift manager who had once overlooked Alan's quiet suffering, she stepped down voluntarily and requested retraining. "If I couldn't see him before," she told Daniel privately, "then I don't deserve to lead until I learn how." Vanessa and Dylan, their names were added to the internal blacklist across all Clearway branches, not as revenge, but as a line drawn in the sand, a declaration that integrity mattered more than clever deceit. And Alan? He never once used his new title to ask for special treatment. He still showed up early, still brewed the first pot of coffee, still smiled at every patient who walked through the door, especially the ones who looked nervous. Only now he had an office, a window, and a plaque outside the door that read, "Alan Brooks, Community Care Director, Clearway Medical, where healing means dignity." One morning, as Daniel walked through the Cedar Brook lobby, he found Alan standing beside a small girl who looked no older than 6, holding a teddy bear in one hand and clinging to her mother's coat with the other. Alan was kneeling beside her, speaking softly. "See? The doctor's just going to check your heartbeat. Nothing scary. And when you're done, I'll show you where we keep the rainbow stickers. Deal?" The girl nodded slowly. Daniel watched, a lump rising in his throat. In all his years building clinics, hiring talent, raising capital, chasing expansion, he'd never once created a moment like that. But Alan had, every day, quietly, faithfully. That's what Clearway had almost lost, and that's what it would never take for granted again. As Daniel turned to leave, the clinic doors slid open, ushering in a new patient, and with it, a new era, not just for Clearway Medical, but for every silent worker whose quiet dignity had ever gone unseen. Because now, thanks to one man who swept more than floors, the system had remembered how to see. There are people like Alan Brooks in every clinic, every diner, every hallway we pass without noticing. They don't ask for praise, they don't seek attention, but without them, the heart of a place quietly dies. Alan didn't just clean the floors. He protected dignity, he restored trust. He reminded a CEO, and all of us, that a system is only as strong as how it treats its quietest soul. So if you've ever seen someone overlooked, someone kind, someone who gives more than they get, don't wait until the cameras catch it. Be the one who sees them now. Comment below. Real heroes don't wear badges. They carry brooms, bandages, and quiet kindness. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because stories like this deserve to be seen.